men who had living sons. Every single one of the 300 had already produced an heir. This was not romantic. It was not a sentimental gesture toward fatherhood. It was the state calculating acceptable losses. If these men died, their genetic contribution had already been secured. Their sons were already in the agoge. The pipeline was intact. Leonidas was not selecting heroes. He was selecting men whose death would cost the system the least. In 480 BC, the Persian Empire under King Xerxes assembled one of the largest military forces the ancient world had ever seen. The exact numbers are debated. Herodotus claims over 1 million soldiers. Modern historians estimate the actual force at somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000, still enormous by ancient standards. The target was Greece. Xerxes had reasons. His father, Darius I, had sent an expedition to Greece 10 years earlier. That force had been defeated at the Battle of Marathon by a primarily Athenian army. The defeat was an embarrassment. Xerxes intended to finish what his father started. The Greeks knew the invasion was coming. They had time to prepare. And they did, partially. The problem was timing. The Olympic Games were approaching, and the Carneia, a major Spartan religious festival, was underway. Spartan law prohibited military campaigns during the Carneia. This was not a suggestion. It was a binding religious obligation. And so Sparta sent 300 men. Not 300 because that was enough. Not 300 because Leonidas believed a small force could defeat an empire. 300 because it was the maximum Sparta would deploy during a religious festival without violating its own laws. This is consistently left out of the popular narrative. The 300 was not a dramatic choice. It was a compromise between military urgency and religious calendar. But Leonidas did not march with 300 men. He marched with roughly 7,000 Greek soldiers. The Spartans were a fraction of the total force. The rest came from Thespiae, Thebes, Corinth, Arcadia, Phocis, and other allied Greek states. These men, farmers, tradesmen, citizens of small cities, marched alongside the Spartans to the pass at Thermopylae. The pass itself was a tactical selection, not a poetic one. Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, was a narrow coastal corridor between the mountains and the sea. At its narrowest point, the pass was wide enough for a single wagon. This meant that the size of the Persian army became irrelevant. The Persians could not bring their full numbers to bear in a confined space. They would have to funnel through the pass in manageable groups, exactly the kind of close-quarters combat where heavy Greek infantry held the advantage. For 2 days, this worked. The Greek coalition held the pass. The Persians sent wave after wave, including the Immortals, Xerxes' elite unit, and each wave was pushed back. Herodotus describes the fighting as grinding and relentless. The Greeks rotated units in and out of the front line, with the Spartans taking the most demanding shifts. The pass held, the mathematics of terrain were working, and then a local man named Ephialtes changed everything. Ephialtes approached the Persian camp and revealed the existence of a mountain path, the Anopeia Trail, that led around and behind the Greek position at Thermopylae. The path was not unknown. Leonidas had posted a force of 1,000 Phocian soldiers to guard it. But when the Persian Immortals advanced along the trail at night, the Phocians retreated to higher ground to defend their own position rather than blocking the path. By dawn, the Greek army at Thermopylae faced encirclement. When word reached Leonidas that the Persians were behind them, he made a decision that has been interpreted as heroic sacrifice for 25 centuries. He dismissed the bulk of the allied army. The specifics of this decision matter. Herodotus gives 2 versions. In one, Leonidas ordered the allies to leave because he wanted to spare their lives. In the other, the allies left on their own when they saw the situation was hopeless, and Leonidas simply did not stop them. What remained was a force of roughly 1,500 men, the 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, who refused to leave, and a contingent of about 400 Thebans, whose motivations are debated. Herodotus suggests they were kept as hostages rather than volunteers. The Thespians are worth pausing on. These were not professional soldiers. Thespiae was a small city. Its 700 men represented a significant portion of its military-age male population. They chose to stay, knowing the situation was terminal, and they are consistently overshadowed in every retelling. No movie has been made about the 700 Thespians. No motivational poster carries their name. They died in the same pass, on the same day, fighting the same enemy. The reason for the remaining force was military, not symbolic. Someone had to cover the retreat of the departing allies. If the entire Greek army turned and ran simultaneously, the Persian cavalry would ride them down in open ground. A rear guard needed to hold the pass long enough for the main force to gain distance. Leonidas volunteered his Spartans for that role. Now, the selection principle becomes critical. Every one of the 300 had a living son. This was not coincidence. It was deliberate criteria. Sparta had a finite number of citizens. The Spartan population had been declining for decades. Every full citizen who died without an heir represented a permanent loss to the system. One fewer soldier in the next generation, one fewer family contributing to the mess hall. By selecting men who had already reproduced, Leonidas ensured that the demographic cost of the rear guard was minimized. Their sons would continue through the agoge. Their landholdings would pass to their heirs. The system would remain intact. This is the calculation that sits beneath the legend. On the final day, Leonidas moved the remaining force forward, out of the narrowest part of the pass and into a wider section. Herodotus describes this as a deliberate shift. The previous 2 days had been fought in the bottleneck. Now, with encirclement inevitable, Leonidas chose to inflict maximum casualties on the open approach. The fighting was different on this day. The Greeks knew the geometry had changed. There was no rotating out, no relief force waiting. Herodotus says they fought with a ferocity that exceeded the previous days. Spears broke. The Greeks switched to swords. When swords were lost or shattered, they fought with hands and teeth. 2 of Xerxes' brothers, Abracums and Hyperanthes, were killed during this phase. The fact that members of the royal family were dying suggests the Persians had committed significant resources, including their command elements, to breaking the position. Leonidas fell during this stage of the battle. What followed his death is recorded by Herodotus in specific detail. The body of the king became the focal point. The Greeks and Persians fought over his corpse in successive waves. 4 times the Greeks drove the Persians back from the body. 4 times the Persians returned. In Greek warfare, possession of a fallen leader's body carried significance. To lose a king's body to the enemy was a catastrophic dishonor. The Spartans understood this. They fought to recover Leonidas, not out of personal grief. They had been trained to suppress that, but because the system demanded it. Eventually, the survivors retreated to a small hill behind the wall, the Kolonos. This is where the final phase took place. The Thebans, according to Herodotus, broke away and surrendered. He says they approached the Persians with hands extended, claiming they had been forced to fight. Some were accepted, others were killed, others were branded with the royal Persian mark. The Spartans and Thespians remained on the hill. The Persians did not close in for a final melee. They stood back and used ranged weapons, arrows, javelins, stones. The remaining Greeks, now without functional shields, and in many cases without weapons, were killed at distance. Herodotus does not describe the final moments as glorious. He describes them as methodical. After the battle, Xerxes walked the field. When he reached Leonidas' body, he ordered the head cut off and the body impaled on a stake. Herodotus calls this unusual. Persians generally honored enemy commanders who fought with distinction. Xerxes' treatment of Leonidas broke that custom. What that tells us is that the 3-day defense had cost Xerxes more than he expected. In men, in time, and in prestige. Herodotus gives a casualty figure of 20,000 Persians killed during the battle. Modern historians regard that as inflated, but even reduced estimates suggest the losses were significant enough to enrage the king. Leonidas' head spent the campaign on a Persian spike. 40 years later, the Spartans retrieved his remains. They brought them home and built a hero shrine. Annual games were held in his name. His name was inscribed on the memorial at Thermopylae alongside the famous epitaph. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie. The epitaph does not mention freedom. It does not mention heroism. It does not mention Greece, it mentions obedience. And laws. 40 years after Thermopylae, Sparta won the Peloponnesian War and became the dominant power in Greece. Within a generation, that dominance collapsed. The reason was demographic. Sparta's citizen population, never large, continued to shrink. The system that demanded total military commitment from every citizen also made it nearly impossible to sustain the population needed to maintain that commitment. Land concentrated in fewer hands. The number of men who qualified as full Spartan citizens decreased with each generation. By the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, Sparta fielded fewer than 1,000 full citizens in battle. The Theban general Epaminondas defeated them. Then he did something that struck at the core of the Spartan system. He marched into Messenia and liberated the Helots, the population that Sparta had enslaved for over 200 years, the population that had fed the state funded the agoge, and made the entire Spartan military machine possible, was freed. Sparta never recovered. Without the helots, there was no surplus. Without the surplus, the full-time military class could not be sustained. Without the military class, the system that had produced Leonidas, the 300, and the legend of Thermopylae had no foundation. The thing that made the last stand possible was the same thing that made Sparta unsustainable. When we watch the 300 on screen, or read the epitaph at the pass, or share the quotes about Spartan shields and Spartan courage, we are looking at the output of a system that took 7-year-old boys and made them into men who could not flinch, a system that declared war on its own labour force every single year, a system that turned reproduction into a state resource and death into a managed transaction. Leonidas stood in that pass because the system had spent 30 years ensuring he could not do anything else. The 300 fought without retreat because retreat had been made unthinkable before they could read. And the Thespians, the 700 volunteers from a small city who chose to stay and die beside them, are the ones history forgot, because their sacrifice was a choice, and choices are harder to turn into systems. The story of Thermopylae is still told as a story about freedom, but the men who died there were the least free men in Greece, and we still haven't decided what to do with that.